Okay, in this chapter, chapter 8, now we're, after having kind of suffered through understanding how economists look at the production decision by the manager and the consumption decision by the consumer, now we're actually getting into the realistic part of what the competitive structure looks like is really going to then determine how you make your output decisions. So if you remember back from your days of principles, there are 4 types of firms, or 4 different types of companies. They would be the perfectly competitive, the monopolistically competitive, the oligopoly, and the monopoly. And what we do in this chapter is we look at perfectly competitive, monopolistic, and monopolistically competitive. And the reason why we're doing it this way is because oligopolies, well, we're going to need to look at those over 2 chapters. I may end up cutting one of them. I haven't entirely decided yet. Because the one chapter gets into a lot more detail than I had actually anticipated. But at least in chapter 9, you will get some introduction to into oligopolies. Oligopolies are cool because the way that we're going to have to talk about them involves the use of game theory. These other structures, 1, 2, and 4, the focus of this chapter, they're a little bit more cut and dry. The way that these firms differ is they differ based on their pricing power. On the one extreme, we have the perfectly competitive firm, which is a price taker. And on the other end of the extreme, we have the monopoly, which is a price maker. And then we have our in-betweens. So we're going to have to look at what each of these types of firms are, how they decide them, what price to charge, and how much to produce. That's our focus for this chapter 8, and then chapter 9, which is what we talk about, the oligopoly. And if we get to 10, we'll look at that in even more detail. Okay, so I'm not actually going to differentiate this. I'm going to focus a lot of time here of this discussion on the second slide, the outline. I don't typically talk about the outline to a great extent, but I think this is useful at least for understanding these differences. Let's start with perfect competition. These again are firms that are price takers. They themselves don't really determine how much is going to be produced, or at least what price is going to be charged, because the decision for that is actually made by the market. So if the market is making that kind of decision, then they're not going to see any ability to alter the price. What they really have to decide is what are going to be their production levels, and that will affect then their profit levels in the short run and in the long run. The monopoly, on the other hand, again, is our price maker. The amount they produce is the industry output because they are themselves the industry. They also get to determine the price that they're going to charge. They are the sole producers, and as such, they get to dictate what the price is going to be. How do they get such great power? they get such great power by having barriers to being in that market. And then we have the monopolistically competitive structure. This is a very common type of structure. What it means is that you have a slightly differentiated product. So you have some pricing power because your product is deemed a little bit different than the others. And as such, you actually have a little bit of control over the market. I mean, I think our best example of this kind of thing would be I guess when I think of this, I think of like the toothpaste market. Toothpaste is a pretty monopolistically competitive structure because on the one side, toothpaste really all does the same thing, right? And it contains largely the same ingredients. Yet they all differentiate their product in some way. Some have whitening power, some have a brand name like Crest that people know very well. Right, and then some people really like Tom's, the natural toothpaste. But it's not like they can charge whatever they want, because even if you love Crest, they can't charge 10 times more than Colgate. Otherwise, people will just buy Colgate. Why is this important to us as managers? Well, the big thing is going to be advertising. The other thing is going to be how much you decide to produce. Okay. The focus of price, quantity, and advertising decisions then are all going to be different based on how many competitors you have, what you have to care about. So as we go through each of these three structures, think about these three components: price, quantity, and advertising decisions. Let's start with perfect competition. So you'll notice here, these are kind of organized here. Since we're dealing with multiple structures here, it might be useful just to keep that kind of thing in mind. The perfectly competitive structure, the one key characteristic is you have free entry and exit into this market. Very easy to enter and leave. Everyone knows everything about each other. Everyone has perfect information. Everyone is selling the exact same product. And no firm or consumer is so big that they get to dictate what others are going to charge and who's going to make what. So everyone has very little market power. Everyone gets to determine, everyone gets to freely decide whether they're going to produce or not, or who they're going to buy from or not. The net result, two things happen. First, the market price is not determined by a firm. The price is not determined by an individual firm. Rather, it's determined by the entire market. And in the long run, these firms do not earn any economic profit. They may make an accounting profit, but remember, economic profit means that we're also taking into account the opportunity costs. And after we take into account these opportunity costs, their net profit will be zero. How does that look? This shouldn't be too surprising. We have a demand and supply curve here for the, the beans market. Agricultural products, they're not exactly perfectly competitive. I mean, I'll say this, perfect competition examples are really hard to come up with, because it's that idea that you have free entry and exit that makes this, that's a pretty high hurdle to jump. But let's just say growing this, growing this agricultural product of beans is a perfectly competitive structure. Which would mean then that in the beans market, the intersection of demand and supply gives me a price. So that when I'm growing corn, or beans in this case, I can sell as much or as little as I want as long as I charge the price. Okay. So we've solved the first part now of the three things: price, quantity, advertising decisions. We've now solved the first part. Price determined by the market. Now, the question is going to be, how much do they produce? So we need the quantity decision now. We know from the previous chapter, previous chapter, how the firms face costs and how these costs then affect their production levels. So with that said, right, if the firm is trying to maximize profit, they would be trying to get maximum profits where the slope of the cost curve is equal to the slope of the revenue curve. The slope of the cost curve is the marginal cost. The slope of the revenue firm is marginal revenue. If I set them equal to each other, I would then be maximizing profit. Interesting that you should say that, Shining. Because then talking about me. Here was my demand curve, right? Because I can sell as little or as much as I want as long as I am this perfectly competitive firm. How does the marginal cost curve... Well, let's before I get into that. The demand curve is the same as the price because the price is given to us by the market. Every time I sell one more, my revenue goes up by exactly the price. There's my marginal revenue. How does the marginal cost curve look? It's J-shaped. And look at that. We now have the preview of how our output decision is made by the perfectly competitive firm. Q is determined by where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost for this type of firm. Now, whether this firm is making profit or not by setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, now what I need to do is I need to compare it to the average total cost curve. Because marginal cost alone isn't going to tell me profit levels. I need the average total cost curve to be able to talk about, to compare then my total revenue to my total cost. Because my total revenue is this whole big rectangle. Right? Total revenue is equal to price times quantity. How much does it cost to make Q? It costs that much. Because that's where my average total cost curve is. The difference then between the two would be the profit, this upper part right here. Now, we see here what I just had written out 2 slides ago, that the profit is then maximized where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. You can solve problems then where I give you a price level, you then know what that price would then equal, also equal to the marginal cost. Right? Because if this is the optimal amount and the price is $20 and the marginal cost will have to equal $20 as well, then the issue would be, could this type of firm, besides earning a profit, also encounter a loss? It could. That loss would then be, same rule here, marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. It's not necessarily this can't be step one, and I'm just putting them in some order here, right? That they find the quantity by setting the marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost. The price is given to me by the market, but it's also the same as my demand curve. Which would mean that in step 3, then I can find either the profit or the loss levels by comparing my total revenue and comparing that to my total costs, where I get my total cost as average total cost times quantity. My total revenue would just be my P times Q. So I'm comparing that rectangle to this rectangle. In this case, this firm is going to have a loss because their average total costs are actually higher than the revenue they're bringing in. Now, let's add to this here a little bit. What happens to this firm? What's going to happen to this kind of firm? This firm is going to make money. This firm is going to earn a profit. Here's my question. What happens next? What happens next in this kind of market is entry. Because firms realize, hey, being in this bean industry is a pretty great deal. People make money from it. The consequence is essentially more sellers, which drives the price down. And it drives the price down until there's no profit. We could do it the opposite situation, right? In the opposite situation, I'll just draw this one really fast here. Where there's a loss. This one's easy to understand because if there's a loss, well, the loss is going to cause an exit from the market. Fewer sellers, right? Because they're going to go out of business. Or they're going to say we could do something better. Those firms exit the market, which causes the price to go up until there's no money to be made. Which essentially means that in the long run, none of these firms are going to make money. They're going to make money possibly in the short run until firms enter. They're going to lose money potentially in the short run until some leave. But in the long run, the firms are going to break even. Now, will the firm always produce if it's losing money? It won't, It might, but eventually it would have to go out of business. But in the short run, it may still produce. It may still produce if we call this the shutdown rule. If the price is greater than or equal to the average variable cost. Remember, average total cost is equal to average fixed cost plus average variable cost. The idea is that, at least in the short run, as long as the firm is making its money back in terms of the resources used to make the product, they could worry about the fixed costs later. But eventually they'll have to. But if they're not, if the price was less than the average variable cost, then it's better to shut down, because then not only are you saving your variable cost, but your loss then would only be your fixed costs. If you shut down, then your loss will be exactly equal to the fixed cost. If you produce at this region right here where the price is less than the average variable cost, then not only do you lose your fixed cost, but you lose a little bit more. But if I can charge something greater than the average variable cost, then my loss is going to be I'm still going to have a loss, but it's going to be less than my total fixed costs. And so this firm will decide to produce, at least for some time. So then what does this mean for the manager? What this means for the manager then is I need to be perfectly aware of what my short run costs are, my average variable costs. And you need to then, as a manager, be quite concerned about what that shutdown point is. When does it make sense to produce something? I was reading something really interesting in Business Week last week, and it was talking about the pricing decisions and the costs for producing the Honda Civic. So apparently there's a lot of competition right now in the compact car space, such that Honda, at least according to some outsiders, is charging a price that is so cheap for their car that given what the supplies are for the car, or what the quality of the car in terms of like the inputs and whatnot, that those prices or those costs are so high that they're not making enough money. So the big question among some economists when they look at that is Honda charging so little that they're actually charging below their shutdown point, but they still actually produce for building market share or some other reason? I think a lot of economists, for the most part, myself included, think that they've got a loss at least in the short run, but they're still charging at least enough for the materials. It's just that they're not making a lot of they're losing a little money, but not that much money. But that's still a pretty big deal when we're talking about a car that people generally want. But again, this highlights the decision you would have to make as a manager. You need to know what your costs are. You need to know what your shutdown point is. When we look at all these firms together then in the short run, and we want to know what their supply curve looks like, their supply curve is essentially the marginal cost curve above the average variable cost, because again, that's the shutdown point. This is the shutdown point. The shutdown point being the average variable cost curve point. And then all of the points of production have to be somewhere along this marginal cost curve, depending on what the price level is. And there we go. Don't know why they wasted a whole slide to say it this way. I've actually got nothing to add to it. The supply curve is all the points in a marginal cost curve above the point where the marginal cost curve intersects with the average variable cost curve. What can we do as well? We can add up all of those individual firms. We can add them up into a supply curve for the entire industry. But I think you should remember from your principles class how to add up supply curves to get a market curve. And I just talked about this on the loose leaf piece of paper back here. If you're trying to learn off of this slide, this would be a very confusing slide to learn this from. Entry and exit in the market, because it is a perfectly competitive structure, drives the price up or down. I'm going to write on here. Refer to my previous loose leaf, though, because I think that's a much better explanation than this somewhat confusing slide. I would have made it better. How this exists in the long run then is different, because in the long run, because the price is driven up or down until none of the firms make any money, is that what we're seeing here in the long run is the no profit, no loss situation. Where that no profit, no loss situation ensures then that we're also at the low point of the average cost curve. And there we go. That prices are equal to the marginal cost, and that the prices are also equal to the minimum of the average costs. So this firm is basically producing things quite efficiently, and in producing things quite efficiently, they're also not making any money at doing it. Now we're transitioning to the monopoly. You'll notice I did not talk about advertising when we talked about perfect competition, because there is no advertising decision to be made when you are a perfectly competitive firm. You are no different than anyone else, which would explain why I don't see... well, you see commercials for Bush's black beans, I suppose, but you don't see individual farmers advertising their beans, right? Because the beans are all combined by a company that then markets them themselves as being different. So there is no marketing decision to be made by the advertising firm. There's no advertising decision to be made by the perfectly competitive firm. Now let's talk about the other end of the spectrum, though, the monopoly. Here we have a single firm that's making a decision where there are no close substitutes. The firm is the market. Their individual demand curve is the market curve. The firm does this by restricting entry into the marketplace. Now, what this means for us here is that the demand curve itself, downward sloping, nothing too interesting here, but the marginal revenue curve is twice as steep. Marginal revenue does not equal price for the monopolistic firm. And again, hopefully this is reviewed from your principles days. The reason why it is not the same as so demand here equals price, but is not the same as marginal revenue. Let's talk about why again. Let's talk about why this is the case. When it was a perfectly competitive firm, it could sell as little or as much as it wanted to as long as it charged the market price. Here, to be able to sell more, the firm must lower the price for all customers. right? Because that's the only way that they actually get to sell it. And so by selling more means they have to lower the price. What that does then is it means that the marginal revenue, yes, they get to sell one more unit, but to sell that one more unit, all of the previous customers now get to pay less, which is why then my marginal revenue is going to be less than this. What gives a monopoly its power? It's going to be a combination. Sometimes only one of these features exists, sometimes all of them exist, but it's going to be either economies of scale, scope, it's the cost structure of the industry, or it's patents or legal barriers. In principles class, we talk a lot about these, but for instance, if I'm Hawaiian Electric, and it's the days before, let's say, solar, where I actually now have some competition. It's the cost structure of delivering electricity that stops this, grumpy customers from making their own electricity in the past. Now, if I get mad at HECO, I can say I'm going to make some solar panels and I'm going to get out of the system, right? I still have to do that with clean water, right? I mean, I could be grumpy with the Board of Water Supply, but in the end, I'm still going to buy from them. In other cases, there's patents, for instance, like with prescription drugs. There might be legal barriers to entry. UH would be a perfect example of monopoly that's basically sanctioned by the state as the only provider of public higher education. And then they could have economies of scale scope, where it only makes sense to have one firm also doing this in terms of the number of inputs that are required. What matters in this is what region of the demand curve I'm then operating on. As we see here, the marginal revenue curve is steeper than my demand curve for these kinds of firms. These kinds of firms are going to operate or produce in the elastic region. And that allows them then to be able to get more customers by changing the price. When it's inelastic, you don't get that same kind of effect. And that's what we start to see here. They're not obviously going to produce where where it's inelastic or where it's negative, where the marginal revenue is below the curve. These kinds of firms are going to be operating in the elastic region of the demand curve. And we could calculate it, obviously, if I gave you the demand function itself. And you can kind of see this kind of example here, where if I tell you what the marginal revenue is for a specific, if I tell you what the price is at a particular amount, I can then substitute that into my inverse demand function to find the quantity, and then from that find the marginal revenue. The marginal revenue is twice as steep as the inverse demand curve. So if you're given the inverse demand curve, all I need to do is multiply that by 2. And that's what you see right here. One of these, I shouldn't have picked. Let's change this to a 4. Okay, obviously it's going to change these numbers. I can't change it to a 4. Good to see econ in action here. It's cool stuff. Okay, what if I change that to a 1? 10 minus q. Then what I'm saying is that the marginal revenue is going to be equal to 10 minus 2q, because it's twice as steep. So all I did was I made the slope twice as steep. I can then set that equal to, right, my cost structure. And if I'm selling 3 units here, actually, no, I can see why they changed it to what they did. Now my marginal revenue at this point will be -4. So obviously I'm not going to produce at a level like that because I'm now in the inelastic region on my demand curve. Here's my production rule for these types of firms. Not going to be surprised by this. Well, just what you've seen before. Marginal revenue equaling marginal cost. Except what we have going on here now is I've got a demand that's equal to price. I've got a marginal revenue curve twice as steep. I've got a marginal cost curve, and now what I'm doing is setting MR equal to MC to find Q. And then I go up to the demand curve to find the price. I have now my production rule and my price rule on this slide right here. I set MR equal to MC to find how much I should produce. And then I find my price by going up to demand at the quantity where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. So MR equal to MC, and then I go up to the demand curve to find the price. There we go. We got 2 of the 3 done for monopolies. Right there. Okay, well, this is just what we've done before. The way that I would maximize profit is by setting the slopes of these 2 functions equal to each other. That would be MR equals to MC. These kinds of firms are going to make money. If we draw this out here in a much cleaner way than this, the way that this looks is I'm going to call P subscript M, Q subscript N to stand for the price charged by the monopolist and the quantity produced by the monopolist. And the piece of information that we're missing here is my average total cost curve. Because now what I could say is that my revenue is this entire large rectangle, but that my costs are only right here. So that difference would then be my profit. These types of firms will always earn a profit. Because why would you want to be a monopolist in a structure that didn't have that kind of thing? And that gives us then our pricing rule. Our pricing rule where we see this difference between the price charged and the marginal revenue brought in. We already talked about this. I've actually got nothing more to say about it. There is no supply curve for the monopoly on some level because the firm is the market. The firm doesn't have multiple supply points given what the cost structure is. They have a single production point. And that single production point is the same for the firm as it is for the market. So, Whereas you have different kinds of firms in a perfectly competitive structure, where different kinds of firms are going to produce only at certain kinds of prices because they have different cost structures. Here, the firm is the market. And the firm will always charge a greater price than the marginal revenue, where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal costs. Why do you care about this? Or why should you care about this, I guess would be another way of saying this. You should care about this as a manager, because what this could mean for you, besides having to make the advertising decision, is how do you do things if you have multiple plants. So let me stop this here just because I worry that the video is getting kind of long, and then I'll start a new video.